The streets of Manhattan pulsed with life horns blaring, people rushing, neon signs flickering in the evening dusk. It was a world that never stopped moving, never paused for anything or anyone. Among the sea of bodies pushing forward, a man in an expensive tailored suit walked with purpose, his polished leather shoes tapping against the pavement with each firm step. Mr. Donovan was a man of power, known in the corporate world for his ruthless efficiency and unparalleled success. His empire stretched across multiple industries: real estate, finance, technology, each bearing the mark of his relentless ambition. But today, his mind was elsewhere. A sharp pain shot through his chest. He winced, slowing his stride. His vision blurred for a moment, the lights around him flickering like distant stars. He shook his head. Not now. Pushing forward, he tried to ignore the discomfort, but with each step, the weight in his chest grew heavier. His breathing turned shallow. A cold sweat broke across his forehead. Then, in the middle of the bustling crowd, his legs gave out. A gasp rippled through the nearby pedestrians as he crashed onto the hard pavement. The world spun around him, faces turning, feet shuffling, but no one stopped. People hesitated, their eyes flickering with curiosity before they moved on. A few took out their phones, not to call for help, but to record the moment. As consciousness began to slip, he heard a voice. "Hey, somebody call an ambulance." A pair of rough, calloused hands grasped his shoulders, easing him onto his back. Through his hazy vision, he saw a young man kneeling beside him, his long, unkempt hair falling over his forehead. His clothes were worn, his fingers lined with the deep grooves of someone who had spent years working with him. Mr. Donovan tried to speak, but his breath caught in his throat. "Stay with me," the young man urged. He checked his pulse, then quickly moved into action. Tilting Mr. Donovan's head back, he pressed down firmly on his chest, counting under his breath. The world faded in and out as the rhythmic pressure of the stranger's hands fought against the pull of unconsciousness. In the distance, sirens wailed, cutting through the murmurs of onlookers. "Just hold on," the young man said again. "Help is coming." Everything went black. The sharp scent of antiseptic filled his nose when he woke. The soft beep of a heart monitor echoed in the quiet hospital room. Mr. Donovan blinked against the fluorescent lights, his mind slowly piecing together what had happened. A doctor entered the room, flipping through a chart. "Mr. Donovan, you're lucky. You suffered a cardiac episode, stress-induced. If that young man hadn't performed CPR, it could have been much worse." Mr. Donovan exhaled deeply. "The man who saved me, who was he?" The doctor glanced up. He didn't leave his name, but the paramedics mentioned he was a street musician. "You were lucky he was there." A street musician. Mr. Donovan closed his eyes, recalling the roughness of the man's hands, the hands of someone who had known both struggle and skill. He had to find him. The rhythmic hum of city life pulsed through the streets as Mr. Donovan's car pulled up near a busy intersection. From the back seat of his sleek black sedan, he peered out at the crowded sidewalks, scanning the faces of pedestrians as they passed. He had spent the last few days recovering in the hospital, replaying the moment of his collapse over and over again. Each time, the memory of the stranger who had saved him became clearer, the long hair, the calloused hands, the quiet urgency in his voice. A street musician, the doctor had said. Mr. Donovan wasn't one to leave debts unpaid, especially not a debt as great as this. His driver, a burly man named Grayson, turned in his seat. "Are you sure this is the place, sir?" "Yes." Mr. Donovan's voice was firm. Grayson nodded, then stepped out to open the door. As Mr. Donovan exited the car, the cool evening air wrapped around him. The city lights glowed against the backdrop of a deepening twilight, illuminating the figures of people passing by, lost in their own worlds. Then he saw him. Just a few feet away, leaning against a brick wall near a subway entrance, sat the young man. A worn-out guitar rested on his knee, his fingers plucking soft, melodic notes that barely rose above the noise of the city. A small, open guitar case lay in front of him, scattered with a few crumpled bills and loose change. Mr. Donovan approached, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. The musician didn't look up, too focused on the tune he was playing. It was a slow, mournful melody, one that carried a depth of sorrow that didn't belong to someone so young. When the song ended, Mr. Donovan cleared his throat. "You're the one who saved my life." The musician finally looked up, his blue eyes sharp with recognition. He studied Mr. Donovan for a moment before shrugging. "Just did what anyone should have done." "That's not true." Mr. Donovan pulled a sleek envelope from his coat pocket and extended it. "I owe you a great deal. Please accept this." The musician glanced at the envelope, but made no move to take it. "What is it?" "A reward," Mr. Donovan said, simply. $50,000. For the first time, a flicker of surprise crossed the young man's face. His fingers tightened on the neck of his guitar, but instead of reaching for the envelope, he shook his head. "No, thanks." Mr. Donovan frowned. "You don't want the money?" "I didn't help you for money," the musician said, shifting his guitar. "I helped because it was the right thing to do." Mr. Donovan was stunned. In his world, everything had a price. Loyalty, success, even kindness. Yet here was a man who had saved his life and was walking away from fortune. "What's your name?" Mr. Donovan asked. "Jake." "Jake what?" The young man hesitated, then simply said, "Just Jake." Mr. Donovan studied him. There was something about the way Jake held himself, the guarded expression, the way he avoided eye contact for too long. It wasn't just humility. It was something deeper. "Why are you out here, Jake?" Jake's jaw tightened. "I play music." "There are better places to play." Jake exhaled sharply. "Look, I appreciate the offer, but I don't need charity." "It's not charity," Mr. Donovan corrected. "It's gratitude." Jake didn't respond. He strummed a few notes on his guitar, pretending to be uninterested, but Mr. Donovan could see the tension in his shoulders. For the first time in years, Mr. Donovan felt something unusual, a deep, nagging curiosity. This man wasn't just another struggling musician. There was more to his story. Slowly, Mr. Donovan tucked the envelope back into his pocket. "All right," he said. "No money. But at least let me buy you a meal." Jake hesitated again, then after a long pause, he nodded. "Fine," he muttered. "One meal." As Mr. Donovan turned toward his car, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to uncover something far bigger than he had expected. The quiet hum of the city filtered through the windows of an upscale restaurant, far removed from the noise of the streets. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of grilled steak and fine wine. Crisp white tablecloths lined the tables, and soft candlelight flickered against the polished surfaces. Jake sat stiffly across from Mr. Donovan, his fingers drumming lightly on the edge of the table. He had agreed to the meal, but now that he was here, he felt out of place. The finely dressed patrons, the waiters in their pristine uniforms, it was a world he didn't belong to anymore. Mr. Donovan watched him carefully, noting the way Jake's eyes scanned the room, as if searching for an exit. "You don't seem comfortable," Mr. Donovan observed. Jake exhaled. "Haven't been in a place like this in a long time." The waiter arrived, placing a menu in front of each of them. Jake barely glanced at his before shutting it. "Just a burger and fries. Whatever's cheapest." Mr. Donovan raised an eyebrow. "You can order anything you like." Jake smirked. "Yeah, but I don't owe you more than I already do." Mr. Donovan let the comment slide and ordered a steak for himself. As the waiter left, he leaned forward. "You're a musician?" Jake shrugged. "Something like that. You play well." Mr. Donovan continued. "More than well. That song you were playing earlier, it wasn't just random chords. It had depth. Training." Jake's fingers clenched. "Why does that matter?" Mr. Donovan held his gaze. "Because you're not just some street musician, are you?" A heavy silence stretched between them. Jake shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Donovan continued. "I had my assistant look into you." Jake's head snapped up, his eyes flashing with something close to anger. "You what?" "I had to find out who saved my life." Mr. Donovan's voice remained calm. "I needed to know more about you." "And I did." Jake said nothing. His jaw tightened, but he didn't get up. He just waited. "You weren't always living on the streets, Jake," Mr. Donovan said. "You were once Jacob Langley." A flicker of pain crossed Jake's face, but he quickly masked it. Mr. Donovan leaned back, watching for any reaction. "A world-renowned pianist?" A child prodigy. The kind of musician who filled concert halls. The kind people paid thousands just to hear perform. Jake stared at the table, his knuckles white against his palms. Mr. Donovan continued. And then, 6 years ago, you disappeared. Jake let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. Guess I wasn't hard to replace. That's not true, Mr. Donovan countered. People wondered where you went. Rumors spread. Some said you burned out. Others said you had a breakdown. But none of them knew the truth. Jake exhaled slowly. And you think you do? No, Mr. Donovan admitted. But I'd like to. Jake hesitated. He had spent years burying the past, running from a name, Jacob Langley. But now, sitting across from this man, with the weight of truth pressing down on him, he realized there was no escaping it anymore. Fine, he muttered. You want to know the truth? Here it is. Mr. Donovan listened intently as Jake finally spoke. I had everything, Jake said, his voice distant. The fame, the money, the sold-out concerts. But behind the scenes, it was a nightmare. My manager, my so-called friends, they weren't looking out for me. They were looking out for themselves. Mr. Donovan didn't interrupt. Jake continued. I trusted them. Signed contracts I didn't understand. Made deals I thought were fair. And one by one, they drained me dry. My manager embezzled my money. My friends turned their backs when I had nothing left. By the time I realized what was happening, it was too late. Mr. Donovan frowned. Didn't you fight back? Oh, I tried, Jake said, a dark chuckle escaping his lips. But my manager had covered his tracks too well. By the time I got a lawyer, I was drowning in legal fees. I lost everything, my house, my career. The label blacklisted me. And when the lawsuits came, I couldn't even afford to fight. Jake shook his head, his eyes burning with a mixture of anger and sorrow. My parents were gone. No family to turn to. No friends left. And just like that, the world moved on. No one cared about Jacob Langley anymore. I ended up on the streets, playing guitar just to eat. Mr. Donovan was silent for a long moment. Finally, he spoke. That's why you wouldn't take my money. Jake gave a half smile, one filled with regret. I learned the hard way that money doesn't solve everything. Sometimes, it just makes things worse. Mr. Donovan studied him, his mind racing. I want to help you, he said finally. Jake scoffed. You already did. You gave me a free meal. No, Mr. Donovan said, shaking his head. I mean really help you. Get your life back. Jake's smile faded. And why would you do that? Because you saved my life, Mr. Donovan said simply. And because you deserve better. Jake looked away. I don't think I do. Well, Mr. Donovan said, leaning back in his chair, that's where you're wrong. For the first time in years, a glimmer of something unfamiliar flickered in Jake's chest. Hope. Jake paced outside the grand, high-rise building in Midtown Manhattan, staring up at the glass tower reflecting the city lights. The entrance was guarded by uniformed doormen and luxury cars lined the curb. He didn't belong here, but Mr. Donovan had insisted. Earlier that day, the businessman had handed him a card with an address and a time. Meet me here. No excuses. Jake had almost thrown the card away. Almost. Now here he was, standing outside like an outsider looking in. He ran a hand through his unkempt hair, exhaled sharply, and walked toward the entrance. Inside, the lobby was polished marble, the air crisp with the scent of expensive cologne and fresh flowers. He felt every eye turned toward him. His worn leather jacket, scuffed boots, and tangled hair made him an anomaly in a world of designer suits and silk ties. A receptionist at the front desk eyed him warily. Can I help you, sir? Jake hesitated. This was a mistake. But before he could turn and leave, a familiar voice called out. Jake! Mr. Donovan strode across the lobby, his sharp, tailored suit a stark contrast to Jake's ragged attire. He clapped a hand on Jake's shoulder and turned to the receptionist. He's with me. The woman nodded, though she still looked skeptical. Mr. Donovan gestured for Jake to follow him toward a private elevator. As the doors closed behind them, Jake stuffed his hands into his pockets. So, what is this place? A second chance, Mr. Donovan said, simply. The elevator dinged, and the doors slid open to reveal a spacious penthouse suite. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city, and a grand piano sat in the corner of the room, gleaming under the chandelier light. Jake's breath caught. He hadn't touched a real piano in years. "I have an event in 3 days," Mr. Donovan said, walking to the bar and pouring himself a glass of whiskey. "It's a private gathering of New York's elite investors, CEOs, artists, musicians." He turned, leveling Jake with a steady gaze. "I want you to play." Jake's stomach twisted. "No." Mr. Donovan sipped his drink, unfazed. "Why not?" "Because I don't do that anymore," Jake said, backing toward the elevator. "I'm not Jacob Langley. Not anymore." Mr. Donovan set his glass down. "You can lie to yourself all you want, but I saw the way you looked at that piano, just now." Jake clenched his jaw. "Even if I wanted to." "You do," Mr. Donovan interrupted. "You're just afraid." Jake's pulse quickened. "I lost everything, Mr. Donovan. My career, my name, my life. And you think I can just walk back into that world like nothing happened?" "No," Mr. Donovan said. "I think you can walk back into that world and prove that nothing can keep you down." Silence stretched between them. Mr. Donovan continued, his voice firm. "You don't have to trust me, but trust yourself. Play at this event, and if you still think you're done with music, I won't ask again." Jake swallowed hard. He glanced at the piano once more, his fingers twitching at his sides. A second chance. Could he take it? He exhaled sharply. "Fine. One night." Mr. Donovan smiled. "That's all I need." The grand hall buzzed with anticipation. Chandeliers cast a golden glow over elegantly dressed guests sipping champagne, their conversations a murmur of wealth and influence. Tonight was an exclusive event, an invitation-only gala attended by New York's elite. CEOs, investors, and celebrities mingled, unaware of the storm about to shake the room. Jake stood behind the heavy curtains, his hands trembling at his sides. He was dressed in a crisp black suit courtesy of Mr. Donovan, but he still felt like a fraud wearing it. The weight of expectations pressed down on him, threatening to suffocate him before he even touched the keys. His heart pounded. 6 years. 6 years since he had last played on a real stage. 6 years since he had lost everything. Mr. Donovan's voice cut through his thoughts. "Nervous?" Jake glanced to his right. Mr. Donovan stood beside him, cool and composed as always, sipping from a glass of bourbon. Jake exhaled sharply. "I don't belong here." Mr. Donovan smirked. "And yet here you are." Jake flexed his fingers, trying to loosen them up. "What if I screw up?" "Then you screw up," Mr. Donovan said simply. "But I don't think you will." Jake swallowed hard. Before he could respond, the sound of a microphone tapping echoed through the hall. A woman in an elegant gown stood at the podium, addressing the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we have a special surprise. A performance from a pianist whose name once graced the world's greatest concert halls. A name many of you might remember, Jacob Langley." The room went still. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "Jacob Langley? The pianist who disappeared? I thought he was dead. No way, it can't be him." Jake's breath hitched. He wasn't sure he could do this. Mr. Donovan's hand landed on his shoulder. "Show them who you are." Jake hesitated for only a second before stepping onto the stage. As he walked toward the grand piano, the murmurs grew louder. Faces stared at him, some in disbelief, others in curiosity. Cameras flashed, capturing the moment. He sat down. For a brief second, the weight of the moment crushed him. His fingers hovered over the keys, frozen. Then he closed his eyes and played. The first notes rang through the hall, clear and powerful. The melody started slow, delicate, a whisper of a story untold. Then, like a storm breaking, his fingers moved faster, the music rising and falling in waves of raw emotion. The room, once filled with chatter, fell into stunned silence. Jake lost himself in the music. The pain, the betrayal, the years of struggle, it all poured out through his fingertips. Each note carried the weight of his past, but with every chord, something shifted. He wasn't just playing. He was reclaiming himself. The final note lingered in the air, hanging like a heartbeat before fading into silence. For a moment, there was nothing. Then thunderous applause. The room erupted. People stood, clapping, cheering. Some even had tears in their eyes. Mr. Donovan smirked from the sidelines, sipping his bourbon. Jake stared at the crowd, his chest rising and falling. He had done it. He was back. One performance. That was all it took. Within hours, the internet exploded. Jacob Langley returns the comeback of the decade. Long-lost pianist shocks the world with stunning performance. Offers flooded in. Record labels, interviews, invitations to perform at the biggest venues. Everyone wanted a piece of the man who had once been forgotten. But Jake wasn't the same naive musician who had lost everything. This time, he had Mr. Donovan by his side, and this time, no one would take what was his. As he stepped off the stage, Jake looked at Mr. Donovan. "You were right," he admitted, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. "I usually am," Mr. Donovan replied. Jake chuckled. For the first time in years, he felt alive. And this was only the beginning.